Blindsight is a hard science fiction novel which mostly revolves around asking a single question. What is the purpose of consciousness from an evolutionary biological perspective? It also, incidentally, asks another question, which is, what if vampires, but in space? As it would turn out, in the hands of a hard sci-fi author like Peter Watts, both of these questions have equally interesting answers. So I think this novel is sort of a fusion between cyberpunk, space opera, and space horror. The plot revolves around the crew of a spaceship making contact with an alien vessel in orbit around a previously undiscovered gas giant in the outer solar system. And while the plot is very much a kind of traditional sci-fi plotline, like something you might see in Arthur C. Clarke, it's written in a very grim, almost Gibson-esque style that gives the impression that all the characters are living in a kind of dystopia. And if you've been watching my channel recently and that sounds kind of familiar, then yeah, this book was very much the inspiration for my most recent video about contemporary fiction being written like science fiction. The style of writing in Blindsight is very much in that kind of grim cyberpunk tradition, even though there's a lot more technical explanations than in Gibson, because it's hard science fiction. Now, hard sci-fi is obviously a bit of an acquired taste. For those who aren't familiar with the term, hard sci-fi just refers to science fiction that is grounded as much in real science and the real world as possible. And this tends to mean that there's a lot of technical explanations in the book, and that the authors sometimes have very impressive academic credentials in addition to being authors. And sure enough, Peter Watts does. He was apparently a professional marine biologist before becoming an author. But despite the implication you might get from another video I made in which I kind of playfully poke fun at hard sci-fi fans, or certain hard sci-fi fans anyway, I very much am a fan of hard sci-fi, and in fact I have a hard time reading any other type of sci-fi at this point. And what I really loved in this book in particular was the focus on speculative evolution in biology. Hard sci-fi often has a reputation for focusing on physics and space travel and things like that. And while that's all certainly in this book, the focus is very much on first contact between humans and an alien species. And Watts's marine biology background really shines through here, because the ideas he has for this species that humans come into contact with in the novel are just so fascinating. I don't really want to give anything away, because I think a large part of what makes this novel enjoyable is the slow process of coming to understand this mystery in which the characters find themselves enveloped. But throughout the novel, the characters find out so much about this alien species, from the way their metabolism works, to the way they synthesize proteins, to the way their nervous system is structured. And all of it feels truly alien in a way that most aliens in science fiction don't. I feel like this novel came at the perfect time for me, because I've been really into speculative evolution recently, largely as a result of watching Biblioradian's genius Alien Biosphere series. So this novel really helped to scratch that itch, and there's just so many good ideas here. However, one thing that hard science fiction is very much not associated with is vampires, which, yeah, by the way, there are vampires in this book. That's a thing. When I first picked up the novel, I was so confused, because I thought maybe the term vampire just refers to like a certain type of person in this world. Maybe it's like a slang term. But pretty early on, Watts makes it clear that no, these are just actual vampires. There are vampires in this hard science fiction novel, and you just have to deal with it. Even though I'm not really a huge fan of vampires and fiction in general, I have to admire the sheer audacity of it. And again, though, Watts's biology background really comes into play here, because the types of vampires that are described in this novel are not exactly plausible, I would say, but he really goes out of his way to kind of sell you on this idea that vampires are a thing that could exist in the real world. Basically, in the world of the novel, vampires were a hominid species that lived back in the Pleistocene or Paleolithic or something, who went extinct and then, in the future, are revived by modern technology. And he goes into all these details about certain weird features of their biology, like the Euclidean glitch, as he calls it, which is this novel's way of referring to the idea that vampires break down whenever they see anything with right angles, aka a crucifix. I guess what I'm trying to say is that he really motivates it a lot, and what's perhaps most impressive is that he ties the whole vampire plotline into the main themes of the novel. And speaking of themes, as I said at the beginning of this video, what this book is about, largely, is consciousness, and not just what consciousness is, but what consciousness is for. Now, I've read a lot of science fiction, and I feel like I've gotten to a point where I'm almost immune to having my mind blown, because I've been exposed to so many ideas. But the ultimate conclusion that this novel comes to about consciousness and how that plays into the plot, it succeeded in blowing my mind, I think. In terms of mind-blowingness, it's like on the level of the Dark Forest hypothesis from the Three Body Problem series. And ever since I read that series, I've been searching for something to give me that same level of awe, and I think that this book pretty much did that for me. And in fact, I think that the comparison to the dark forest hypothesis goes beyond the surface level, because the ideas that this novel gestures towards are fundamentally questions not just about consciousness, but also about the Fermi paradox and what we might expect alien life to be like. And this novel gives its own wholly original and interesting interpretation of first contact based on those ideas. What's funny about the big conclusion that this novel comes to about the nature of consciousness is that apparently Watts said that he didn't really believe it himself when he wrote it, but in the years since the novel was published, there has been increasing evidence to support this hypothesis that he just kind of threw out there. He said that he included this aspect of the story just because he thought it would make for an interesting story, but that he might have also by accident stumbled upon something really interesting and fundamental about biology, which is pretty cool. But of course, I'm not going to say what that conclusion is in this book. I would definitely encourage you to read the book itself. Or alternatively, there are some great videos on the YouTube channel Quinn's Ideas about this book and the conclusions it comes to, and I will link those in the description if you want to watch those instead. In reading about Peter Watts after finishing this novel, I've seen a lot of people saying that his books, and this book in particular, are quite depressing. And I can see where they're coming from, because the novel is so grounded and reductionistic, you might say, that it seems a little bit nihilistic, especially with the overall dystopian cyberpunk vibe going on. But I also think that there's a real sense of wonder in this novel that harkens back to like the old era of sci-fi, like Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov, that kind of thing. This sense of exploration and wanderlust and learning about the universe and new species. Even as it's mixed in with horror, it's also just interesting for its own sake. And I really appreciated the amalgamation of those two different styles of sci-fi writing. Regarding characters, I think for a hard science fiction novel, this book is pretty character-focused. The protagonist of the novel, Siri Keaton, works as what's called a synthesis. He analyzes data in a way to communicate the main points of that data to different audiences without himself necessarily understanding the data. It's all a bit vaguely defined, and there's a lot of mention of rotating topologies of data and things like that. But his career very much affects his worldview, and again, it does tie into the themes of the book, so there's that. Of the other characters, there are some really interesting ideas relating to cybernetic enhancement. One of the characters, for example, has what you might call dissociative identity disorder, except it's something she did to herself on purpose in order to help her fulfill her duties as the crew's linguist. She has 4 different personalities grafted onto just her one brain. And yeah, I couldn't help but find some similarities between her and another character from another popular book series I've talked about a lot on this channel, which if you know, you know. Overall, I think this book is an utterly fascinating and compelling read. And in case you need something else to encourage you to read it, the book is completely available under Creative Commons. It's free to read online. I was actually shocked when I first heard about this book and I looked it up and found that you could just read it and many other Peter Watts books for free. But apparently it's because Watts, shortly after the novel released, realized the novel was going to bomb, that it wouldn't be nearly popular enough to make money, and so he just decided to release it under Creative Commons. And according to him, that decision, quote, rescued Blindsight from the oblivion to which it otherwise would have been doomed. He's a little bit ambivalent about whether that move would be helpful for other authors, but for him, it seemed to have skyrocketed him to success and kind of cemented this novel as a staple of science fiction, and funnily enough, make the book financially successful when it otherwise wouldn't have been. I definitely think it's really cool when authors do stuff like that, and I'm almost certainly going to read more of Watts's novels in the future, because when they're all free online and they're this good, like, why not? Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. I know it's been like forever since I've done a proper book review, and I'm sorry. I really want to do more of them in the future, especially if I can keep them relatively short and sweet. Some of the other non-review videos I've been doing on my channel have really popped off recently, and I'm super happy for that, but I do want to continue doing stuff like this. Anyway, thanks for watching again, and have a wonderful day, everyone.